Hello, welcome to the Go Crisis podcast with me, David Eades, and Elmarie Marais. Elmarie, good to see you.
Hi, David. Good to see you too.
You've been, well, absurdly busy once again since our last podcast, all manner of things as well. 2025 has started in a bit of a rush.
It has. It is. It is. Unfortunately, we have been busy, as you can imagine, with everything that's going on in the news. But always happy to help. Always ready. But yes, there's going to be lots of lessons that I've learned only in the short 2 months of 2025 that we will hopefully be able to share here at some point.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? You have to say, unfortunately, we've been busy because good for business, but not necessarily good for everyone out there having to deal with some of these issues. But this is a podcast, of course, which focuses very much on uh, challenges and experiences that come from disaster, from response to recovery, issues of communication, policy as well, both for governments and for companies, which rather sets up well our guest for today. That's Lucy Easthope, who's one of the foremost voices and indeed academics and experts in the whole realm of disaster recovery, disaster response. She's also the author of When the Dust Settles, which is an amazing account of her own experiences. A little bit more on what's to come in her publishing role, but have a listen to our conversation with Lucy.
Hi, Lucy.
Hello.
Hi. So good to see you. Thanks for joining us. I am always delighted to see you. In fact, Conrad, my husband, said, "Are you sure you want to do this live?" And I said, I'm sure it's not live." But because you're an absolute power rocket, and I knew that you're going to bring a lot of conversation and opinions here, which I'm very excited to hear. But Lucy, I wanted to start by saying that we both worked for the same disaster management company many years ago, and you stopped working for them just as I started. And I remember everybody talking about Lucy Payne, Lucy Payne. And I was like, who's this Lucy Payne? She sounds like an enigma. And almost 20 years later, here we are, and our paths have crossed so many times in our careers, and here we are talking about what that looked like looking back. So I'm excited to hear from you.
Oh, it's lovely to be here. And it's funny to see that reference to my maiden, the life before the married name. And in fact, it's so funny because once Lucy Easthope was in fact told that she should look up the research of Lucy Payne because Lucy Payne had been great. So it's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, that was the beginning. And it wasn't where it all began for me in terms of disaster activism, because I'd been a very passionate child and teen about wanting to care for people after disaster. But it was where, as you well know, you kind of see it en masse constantly, and you learn. I think you just learn so rapidly, and it's so lovely to sort of we've both had in many ways such similar experiences, and to bring those together as we do now so often, and the trust that you place in me. I think you get the spirit and the soul that's in me because we've walked this path together.
Yeah, exactly. And David, just to give you an idea, when I meet Crossroads, when we manage all kinds of difficult situations, Lucy is one of the people that I call. She's my caller friend, and an incredible sounding board and such a voice of reason, which you sometimes need if you're in the thick of it.
Am I allowed to join in this conversation? I mean, I feel like the
Yes,
bystander a little
please.
bit.
Lucy,
Lucy,
Come on
we
in,
met.
come on in.
David, meet
Well,
Lucy.
well, we met a year ago, and
Yeah.
but I can say, and I'm going to just plug it without
Oh.
any shame. When the Dust Settles is the book, the BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week at the time, a couple of years ago. So I do at least know Lucy Payne as much as much as Elmarie possibly. It's a great read. It's not a bedside read, is it? Because it is about disaster and trauma and the challenges. But one thing that really jumped out at me is the sheer breadth and variety of issues you have dealt with, and your interest from an absurdly young age, Lucy. So it's almost like you were cut out for this stuff.
Yeah, but born with it. And actually, one of the things that gives me so much hope now is meeting very, very young people who are similarly activated, and that's something I think our field really has to nurture. When we bring in new staff and apprentices and things like that, because it is something where I'm so grateful that where I channeled rage and anger and distress at the stage of the world went into a career. And at the moment, I think we're telling young people there's not much to do with those feelings. So for me, it was very early on. There's a New Yorker profile of me where my lovely dad talks about how it felt to kind of parent that interest, wanting to watch the news, wanting to understand how people were treated after disaster. And then particularly for me, it was the Hillsborough football stadium crush of April 1989, which changed my world. My dad had school children at the match. I had classmates at the match. I was 10. And from that point on, I knew what I wanted to do. It's a difficult thing to take to the careers service, that you want to work in frontline emergency response, but you're very unlikely to, say, pass any police fitness tests, but that's where you want to be. I went off to study law. And then again, like a lot of people, September 11th, 2001 changes the world for me again. And I realized I don't want to be doing this from behind a desk. I want to be there and I want to understand. And then as time has gone on, that is evolved. And I think, your question also points to this idea of seeing so many things over and over again gives you an evidence base that when Elmarie does phone me up, generally what she'll get from me is, aha, I've seen this somewhere else and this is what they tried. So it's a lifetime of privilege, I would say. It's incredible, incredible honor to have done any of this.
Is it from all those different examples, and they are so different, aren't they? You mentioned a couple, 9/11, which everyone would be able to reference. You've skirting things like Hillsborough, very close to home. I know you mentioned Herald of Free Enterprise, again, very, very close. And you were very young at the time, but it's right on the border then. And then you've got issues like the Marchioness. You've got flooding cases. You've got MH370. There's a really wide variety of what we see as disasters. So where's the common ground, Lucy? Can you have a common ground? Can you piece together a sort of formula for dealing with these things?
There are things that you see so frequently. I mean, I think responders quite rightly are trained to always see the uniqueness and the specificity, and that's important, and not to come in with past assumptions, and always to see the individuals involved in the tragedy as individual, and to understand what they might need that's new, that's a curveball. But what you do see is that humans, wherever you are in the world, have a lot of the same needs. The meaning of a gentle smile, the offer of a warm beverage, they work wherever you are. And also, I think what you do tend to see is a similar path walked on every continent. So things like the pathway to a resting grave and a memorial, the big thing, and it's always an honour to take any questions from Go Crisis on this. Go Crisis are at the kind of forefront of returning personal effects, and that is the thing that at the end of my days, when everything is said and done, that's the thing I'm proudest of, is to have been alongside, it obviously wasn't just me, but alongside men and women fighting for an ethic of care in the return of items either on the person or at the scene or in the crash site, of suitcases, of belongings, and then to take that everywhere, to take that anywhere. So to apply that care of personal effects right now to things like hospital corridor care, where people are not being looked after properly in hospitals, or things like disease epidemics. The personal effects work travels wherever I am in the world. It has the same meaning, the loss of the furniture of self. And for a long time, and of course, writing When the Dust Settles, you're writing about a lot of different things that you're proud of or you're keen to imbue lessons about, but actually I think it'll always come back to the personal effects.
I totally agree with that, Lucy. I've recently been in Amsterdam at the big ICAO conference that they have every couple of years on families, victims and families. Oh, sorry, families of victims of aviation disasters. And the families were there. They were from all over the world, different cultures, different places, different decades of disasters. And the one thing that was such a huge theme was personal effects. My wife's phone could have had a message on there to me. Was there a photo on there? What that will show what she last did or enjoyed? Personal effects was a very big theme on the frustration and the pain of not being able to get those back. And of course with the reasonability of, is it available? Has it been badly damaged? Is it safe to, return it? All of that taken into account. That was a big theme with families. And the other thing that stood out was how they were treated and the dignity and the privacy that was lost during these disasters and the care that they were given. That was the two big themes.
But
Absolutely. And I
it's
think
interesting.
the way they are treated, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead, Lucy.
No, just to say, I think sometimes with families, if they know there's something that some families have said to me that, gosh, the trouble you went to with the personal effects also tells me the trouble you went to in the things I didn't get to see, like the management of the remains or the setting up of the covering of the scene and the support at the scene. So the personal effects communicate to the families as well.
There is something, though, Lucy, which you referenced fairly clearly, which is it feels to me such a challenge. By and large, people in your field, I'm sure, care deeply. They want the best outcome for the relatives, for the victims. But of course, sometimes, maybe because of culture, maybe just their own attitude, they will think it's probably best that I don't do this, or I don't let the relatives have to deal with that. I'll take this on myself. And that sort of an assumption as to what is the best thing to do is very natural, very human, and probably very practiced actually. But also, I guess from your perspective, it's also very dangerous, isn't it? Because at these times of there is no more acute pain that humans go through than perhaps losing a loved one or being involved in something so disastrous or traumatic that the whole world's talking about it and you lose loved ones. But you want to be in charge of everything, don't you? You don't want anyone to make decisions for you about, I shouldn't see this, or maybe they don't need that, or all those little details that we might think we're doing someone a favor.
And I think, one of the challenges that I put back to responders is it's still lying. So the early stages of my career, we're coming out of a series of disasters here in the UK in the 80s and 90s where a lot of lies had been told to families. And we said, oh, we won't do that again. But saying, I can't give you that back, saying they were sleeping at the time of the death, saying these things, it's still lying, even if you think you're doing it for the good reasons. And one of the things that Elmarie and I will talk about a lot is the censoring of items, but also things like the censoring of information. I do think, there's a pendulum that swings. And one of the things sometimes now more than ever is I'll go to incidents and sometimes we've gone the other way and we're saying the families will make every single decision. Like we're going to give them a chair catalogue so they can decide which chairs they sit on at the assistance centre. And there are times when they just need our comforting arms to make sure there's a range of food, culturally appropriate food, there's tea, there's places for them to sit. And they have the space and the freedom at their own pace to think about things. I do think there's a middle ground, and that can seem like I'm being counterintuitive, but that's because more and more now we're delaying things that are very important, or we are holding back information far too late. And there are things that as responders we have to do. So it's not an excuse for responders to say, I'm waiting for the families to tell me what they want. Because with something like personal effects, Elmarie and I will make a decision that something needs to be saved at the site and it can be destroyed later if that's what the families want. But we can't wait while the rain pours down on the scene. So we will take a decision at the start that all of these things are important and valuable. The scene is important and valuable. And then you work with the families. Whereas with some incidents I'm seeing, people are saying, oh, well, the families haven't told us that yet. They are waiting for the worst possible news. They are in a limbo. They are hoping that their loved one never boarded that train. It is not right for them to have to make great big decisions all the time, which I then climb over the fence and say, of course, when it comes to things like returning items, they have every say, the condition the items are returned in. And the reason I make that point, which is almost like two different conflicting points, is that's the challenge if you're a board of a company today, is you can't just swing the pendulum now from the 80s and 90s, families' very limited choices, to now they'll tell us what they want when they tell us. It is a middle ground where your response plan has to be very flexible, very intuitive, and very up with the times. And it's so important with something like the ICAO conference to hear what people are saying. So one of the things this field has completely had to innovate for is digital technology. Like when Elmarie and I were starting out, like I remember having a discussion with a corporate client. Could we allow the families to have some photos back that had been saved to a corporate great big clunky laptop? In the time that we have been working, the average family now, one airline told me, had 16 to 20 electronic devices as a family. That has transformed the way we think about personal effects and the way that people, as Elmarie was saying, these are a story into the past. Body worn technology. Many families now, for example, are disputing that the time of death they're given by medical professionals. They're saying, but the body worn technology says something else. We have to adapt and innovate all the time to the world and to the families.
Exactly. I can actually give an example. And this is something that Lucy and I worked on together. We processed personal effects, and it was a building collapse. We were working on that, and there was the question of electronic devices. And so, what we put it to the families to say, look, if we can't switch the device on safely, if there's no way of identifying whose this device belongs to, it cannot go into the catalog of unassociated items for anyone to claim. But the decision and the risk associated with the decision on whether we are going to put it in the catalog, and my dad's laptop could end in anyone's hands at some point because I didn't know it belonged to him. The family took that decision and said, no, what we'll do is if we can identify it belongs to us, we will have it. If we can't, it will be destroyed. So it is just consulting every step of the way with them over what they feel comfortable with.
Absolutely. And avoiding paternalism. And that, you know, one of the things that I've also been very privileged to see in my career is the evolution of family groups, you know, advocacy within people at the worst time. And that's something that I'm really, really interested in, but really keen to support, because I think, again, we've swung this pendulum and we infantilize families and bereaved and survivors. And that's something that, you know, we'll often see people like Elmarie advocating to prevent.
Could you, Lucy,
Exactly.
could you, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got a little bit of delay there. Lucy, can you expand on that a little bit for me in terms of an area you see as that you really want to explore? And what should the outcome be?
I think one of the things that has always been a feature of my career is responders and corporations actually being quite afraid of family advocacy and survivor advocacy. We have a tension where often lawyers are quite defensive about that role, but understanding their value, but also the likely questions. One of the interesting phenomenon is sometimes, for example, you will see questions about who funds a family advocacy group now. Should that become part of, say, a compensation package? And that can be very, very interesting. And also one of the things that I end up chatting to various advocacy groups about is looking after themselves in this. This is a very long fight. And I think there's a role for somebody like me sometimes in things. I have such a loud social media profile now in things like correcting myths. So I think we've obviously seen a series of air disasters recently, and generally, and I'm not sure in all the cases, but generally the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act was applied, and the airlines were doing certain things that are absolutely bread and butter. Elmarie and I were very familiar with it. And the media was saying, oh, clearly they're trying to buy off the passengers and buy off the survivors. And so it's really important that people are very quickly, I think, able to access information that brings them up to speed. And that was, I saw a podcast this week that's really praised one particular airline that had an incident this month for very quickly linking and explaining its obligations in family assistance. And that's something corporations really need to be ready to do.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose for me, Lucy, and I've been on a few disaster sites. 2025 has not been a great start for aviation, and it's been very interesting. I've been in different parts of the world where there's been major disasters this year already, but the difference in how different organizations in different countries respond. And I think that which is quite glaringly obvious to me still, is the absolute diverse sort of assumptions on what the responsibility of the airline, or the, not just aviation, the corporation that has suffered this disaster, what their obligations are versus what the government will be doing. So the public, would you say the media has got assumptions on, have they done this? They're trying to buy people off. And, we in the industry understand this is basic practice. This is actually really good practice, in fact. But then there's things that should happen in from the perspective of the organization's obligation to the affected people. And I felt that in some of the incidents we've responded to only this year alone, that there was quite a divide in this is a government responsibility versus no, this is the airline's responsibility. And there's many organizations that still don't really know what good looks like. And aviation generally does. The big flagship carriers know their obligations, and we've seen that already this year. But what's your opinion on that? How do we close that gap? What is the government's responsibility versus the company's responsibility or duty of care, I should say?
And this is a really important one, because anybody with any kind of business that could go wrong suddenly, and particularly those with what we call high reliability, high risk, so that any going wrong could be very, very catastrophic, really needs to understand both their obligations and the statutes that apply to them. They then need to be having some very tough conversations with their lawyers. So, for example, in my work, sometimes I'll see a board come back to me with a very kind of linear idea of their obligations, but that will leave a very grey area where their clientele or their passengers will be unsupported. So I would then say, you go back to your board, and you know maybe your insurance doesn't cover that bit, and your lawyers are saying you don't have to do that bit, but can you imagine? So we were having a discussion here in the UK about if there's a terrorist incident at a venue, whose responsibility was it to get families away and home? And everybody was saying, well, it's not my responsibility. Okay, but think about how that looks tomorrow morning. And so one of the things we're really trying to get everybody to talk about from all sides, local and central governments, all of the different contractors and the private sector, is where are these what my colleague calls spaces of liminality? Where are the gaps? Where's the grey area? And literally in something like the Manchester Arena bomb attack, there was a grey space of ownership and that was where the bomb went off. Of course it did. So one of the things you bring home to your exercises and training as a board is these gaps. So for about maybe a third of my week, I'm assessing, I'm an independent advisor, I'm assessing plans, and I'm fascinated between these little dangerous crevices. One plan stops and another plan starts. Of course, the other thing that you're seeing is a very inconsistent message from governments around the world. Governments are in perma-crisis all around the world. We've had more elections than we've ever had in history in 2024. And one of the big themes across the world is finance and money. So what I would be saying to boards is, let's model the response where it's all on you. You do it all. And if somebody says, hang on, let us pick up those pieces, let us provide a leaflet, that's great. Now, that's very different. Say in the UK in the early 2000s, the government had brought in new emergency management legislation. They were saying, we'll do it all. And in fact, we had actual physical battles in airport exercises over whether the local authority got to respond or whether the airline did the stuff. My view now is those days are gone, and boards need to be ready. Clients are very, very savvy. Passengers are very savvy to their obligations. Now, there's a little bit of a limit on that. We had the wildfires 2 summers ago across Europe, and what holiday companies were saying to me then was people were coming to them saying, I've heard nothing from the Foreign Office. What can you do for me? And they'd say, well, when did you fly out with us? And they said, oh, no, we didn't. But you're just a really trusted name on this island. And what was actually really heartwarming was holiday companies saying to me, can we respond? Shall we respond? Like, we would like to. This is a family, didn't book with us at all, nothing to do with us. In fact, they came to the island on a camper van. But what I would then be saying to boards, again, and this all has to be part of your exercise and training regime, is being very clear on your communications and being very clear back to your governments that they are massively expecting the private sector to step into embassy and government responsibility. That all needs to be done in peacetime. Don't wait for an incident to have those conversations.
This is really interesting in terms of what companies should be expected to do, Lucy. But can I ask you this? What do you think most drives government policy on these things? Because if we go back to 7/7, so some while ago now, 20 years, goodness, there was a sense, I think, that governments realised the importance of being in control of these matters and therefore investing much more in them, providing more resource. Whereas we're in a world today, short of another major disaster, where perhaps it's a harder nosed world at the moment. There's less money around. So what do you think drives the government's perspective on how much responsibility or even kind of put it control they feel they should have?
Control is a very important word in this, and I think many governments actually around the world haven't been as kind of terrified as the UK government have for fear of losing control in emergencies. So that's quite important, because one of the great things about working internationally is you get to compare, and different cultures do manage emergency preparedness and emergency response differently, and of course it mirrors the culture that they have. So often you look at policies that are working very well in Japan or working very well in Asia, and you can't necessarily see that they would translate specifically to Britain or America. Britain, I think, often quite likes to sell an idea that it's not terribly controlling, but in emergencies, what it wanted to do was absolutely manage the response and particularly manage the recovery. And that came out of the Blair-Brown time of government. And that is something I critique a lot in my writing, because there be dragons. One of the things that is very important in the human aspects and the humanitarian response to disaster is allowing the things to go wrong, allowing the people to have an example I would give is a very organized vigil, and then some family groups say, I don't want that. I want to go and be in this front room over here. And of course, Elmarie and I would say that is right and that is okay. And governments would say, oh no, we've got to bring them all back together. So I think a lot of policy setting in emergency planning has been very control focused. It's also focused on very certain types of disaster. It doesn't always understand the long tail of disaster, and it prioritizes certain things. And that's one of the things, to go back to the earlier point, personal effects are not important in a lot of policy making. The right to clarity on what happened to a loved one at the last few minutes of their life is not important. So actually, one of the things about the long campaigning for family assistance in disaster is we're rebels. We've been hugely rebellious in reprioritizing. It had to be made law in 1996 in America, partly because it's not allied with militaristic macho functions of how places respond in emergency planning. And things like the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act changed the world for that reason.
I think for me, it's the part is that aviation has led. Well, actually, it was families who has led the legislation that's out there in aviation and the regulations that are out there. It's been family led, really, and it's sad that tragedy has to happen for people to really, really pay attention to something, and it's got to be the voices of people who have lived through the pain that will make us or the action these legislations. But it's not many other industries that are anything like this in place the way aviation have it in place. So that's quite interesting, is how do we get other industries to adopt these very same standards of how to look after affected people when they've been involved in a disaster that involves your organization?
And this is a big concern that we're having in areas, as you say, that have always been adjacent to, but not necessarily bound by the same law, or countries that have adhered to it as a sort of indication of goodwill, but again, we're not bound by it. So here in the UK, but also adjacent industries like train travel. And if I'm honest with you, and it's something you and I know are very worried about, we're seeing some sectors going backwards. The other thing that we're seeing some sectors not do, and this is, I've just done a conference with oil and gas and offshore energies, and it was really, really powerful, because the other thing that we're seeing these high risk, high reliability industries not doing is reflecting on what the pandemic has done to their workforce, which is very relevant to all of this. So they're trying to apply disaster management principles as it was in 2019, forgetting that workforces are fatigued, forgetting that people's compassion fatigue is set in. I do believe that's a real thing because I've seen it. People's own relationships and home situations have changed. So we are responding differently inside these disasters. So for me, there is a bit of a kind of sort of klaxon at the moment to say we have to stop being complacent. And one thing you and I would definitely say, I started my conference talk with it last week, is a lack of an incident in your industry does not mean you are either safe or ready. It just means there's been a lack of an incident, and you have to be ready to go now for these things to happen to you. And the plans are old. They're 6-7 years old, and the world has changed. And that's another thing that you know me, I like to start my conferences with a bit of a sit up and listen moment. If your comms plan is dated 2019, pre-pandemic, it will not work, because what people are expecting of you has changed. That authentic truth, people questioning you, as I say, we're seeing more and more kind of questioning of what you and I know as traditional processes, but people are thinking, am I trying to be bought off here? Is this misinformation? And the other thing, and this really gets me into trouble if I use it at conferences, but me saying, if you're trying to put to a coroner, an inquiry, an inquest, a chief constable, a police officer, that your plan is good enough and it hasn't been renewed in the last 2 years, I don't think that stands. I think you have to constantly be looking at your family assistance plans with a fresh eye for how the world has changed. And also family assistance plans have to dovetail with comms plans. You have to be ready to explain your assistance process. So I'm quite tough, as you know, when it comes to plan evaluation for boards.
I think you've said a few things that are vital, but I think the theme, and this comes out in every conference, in every meeting, in everything, is you've got to plan, you've got to test the plan, you've got to exercise the plan. And a lot of people, organizations, they do it and I tick the boxes, they do all of these things, but to come back from your earlier point is that it cannot be done in isolation. You've got to engage all the different agencies that are going to be involved in a response that involves your passengers, of your staff or your employees, or your customers. And that's where I often see there's a little bit of a gap. Is it's these government exercise, airports exercise, they involve a few people, but if you have control over inviting the right agencies to your planning, to your exercising, and building those relationships before you need them, is so important, isn't it?
Can just
Yeah.
before you answer that, Lucy, can I ask you? I want to ask you this. I know how persuasive you are because I've seen you in action. But when you're talking to companies saying, "Look, we need to create a scenario where you imagine government plays no role. You've got to take all responsibility." I mean, I appreciate it's a scenario a little bit, but what is there? Honest response to that? I mean, they might go through the process of saying, all right, well, let's do as Lucy says. I don't want to rough up Lucy because that won't go down very well. Um, but then afterwards, when you're having a drink, and they'll say, well, of course, that's not government's really important. What is their sort of thinking? Because they've still got, in fact, more than ever, they've still got quarterly figures to think about. They've got shareholders, they've got results to give. They are not looking to shell out more money for more training, for more contingency planning, etc.
I think that was definitely, and I wouldn't be naive enough to think that it's not still an issue. It was definitely harder to make the case before the pandemic. There is something about living through something we were supposed to either prevent or not see that has kind of, I mean, one of the things, and you're very kind to suggest they wouldn't want to upset me, but the other thing is about, it's very difficult. And I've talked a lot about the kind of Cassandra role as a woman in emergency management. It's a pretty big thing to be right on, that they are going to see these kind of events. So I have definitely noticed, I don't know if this is the same for you, Elmarie, but I've noticed a much more receptive audience the last few years. They are also doing what we call isomorphic learning. They're looking to the left and the right of their neighbours and thinking, wow, they just had this, and we don't know if we could cope with that. So it's stopped being as hard a sell, I think, as it used to be. And also the sort of the failure to manage your reputation and the outrage is coming at people very quickly, but simultaneously they're also getting to see what managing it well looks like. With some of the incidents that have really kind of, we seem to have a very tumultuous start to 2025, and we're seeing some very good management of families, and that the word is spreading on that. So to be honest, it's always been part of my career, has been a really hard sell for this type of work, but less so now than ever, which is good for my kind of aching bones. Like the easier it is to sell this to a board, the better.
Yeah, that is actually quite incredible to hear you say that, because that has definitely changed for us in the industry. It's no one ever actually says it out loud, but you know that in the back of their minds is that this will never happen to us, or it will happen once we are ready for it to happen. And we know that it happens at 2 a.m. We just got a call last night at 2 a.m. That we are needed to support. So it happens on Boxing Day. It happens in times that you are definitely not ready. You've got a few people in place. So yes, absolutely. And it is that complacency, or that it will happen when we're ready, which is something that we've seen a lot before COVID. And there's a few a few conversations that have happened since that has really, really made a difference. I agree with that.
I've got a couple of thoughts for you, Lucy. Part is it's sort of lessons, and there'll be reason for that in a moment, which people will appreciate. But when you look at the trajectory of your career and how much you've tried to bring in change, and you have instigated significant change, how far along that road do you think we are as a society to getting where you would want to be as a near perfect scenario for looking after relatives of disasters, for looking after the victims, whether that's done by company or government? I mean, obviously your work is never done, but how much progress have we made? How much have we learned, do you think, that isn't then lost just because the last disaster was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago?
I think one thing, and it's actually a very personal question, because one thing that I was trying to do for a long time, and it's something that the author of the New Yorker profile that he did on me really drilled down, which was very, very emotional, was I think for a long time I'd appointed myself, and not in a grand way, but this idea that we would get it right one day, and as long as enough people turned up and shouted, and whenever we got it wrong, it felt like a piece of me was dying. I couldn't bear it to get going. Obviously I didn't have oversight of every different type of incident, but certainly in the UK there was this sense of, I must always make sure I'm available, I must make sure there's always advice, I must always be there to mentor colleagues. And actually a big part of the last few years has been coming to terms with the idea of, these are always fragile rites and rituals. They will always need champions, and that allowed me to slightly shift my focus, which was to support the colleagues around me and coming up new to the field. I do a lot of work with our students and our apprentices, that actually we will always need watchkeepers and lantern bearers. We will always need people who say, this is the right way to treat personal effects. It wasn't on me to do it all. And that's been a key observation. Another thing has been that sometimes it will go wrong, and how to process that. The other thing I think I'd made a real kind of observation, and again a piece with, was, a newspaper is never going to run a headline that says, big company does well in major incident. So actually what I learned to look for is, where was the good, what did go well, and that's where my kind of academic lens was coming through, of watching these little things that had made the difference, digging deeper, understanding something beyond even the inquiry report's initial view of it. So one of the things, for example, in the inquiry report into the very devastating Grenfell fire in June 2017, which I write a lot about in When the Dust Settles, the inquiry report says, respondents didn't consider faith needs properly, and didn't source halal food. Now, Elmarie and I have known that that's a requirement for years, so that felt quite unusual and dismissive. And I'd been involved in that response. And one of the things that I think responders did was they knew they needed to get halal food. They understood a religious need on paper. They knew how to source it. The inquiry had sort of stopped at the failing but hadn't drilled down. And for me, the failure had been not that they didn't understand that they needed to get halal food, but they didn't understand devoutness. And they thought that survivors of an incident, if they were hungry enough, would eat anything. If they were busy enough for the incident, they wouldn't pray. If they were, in need of family assistance that didn't take their cultural needs into consideration, they'd accept a male person coming into a female setting. It wasn't about not having the card that said this is what Muslims need. It was about understanding devoutness. And that's the difference between somebody like working with Elmarie who gets it and somebody who has a booklet that tells you what different faiths need in an air disaster, which we were all issued with in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And I'm desperate now for inquiries and inquests to look deeper into what people need, because actually the other thing, and I go there in some of my new writing, and Elmarie will know this very much, we can do bad help now.
Yeah.
We can be so keen to do the two things. We can go too far. We can be very unhelpful. We can aid vulnerability. We can create a complete dispensability. We can put things like care workers and key workers in for too long. So one of the big conversations Elmarie and I will often have is around exit strategy. My job now is to support the people that come after us to continue to bang the drum. And also that's very therapeutic for me because I get to see amazing interventions all the time.
Lucy, it's so fascinating that you say this, because it is, whenever you speak, I just feel like you are reciting my life. It's really, really incredible. The fact that you were saying how frustrating it can be when you feel like you know the answer, but you cannot, get that message across loud enough to the rest of the world who are responding to the same disaster. I've just come back from a big one over in the Far East, and that was something that I've struggled with. It took me a long time to come back from the disappointment of not being able to make the difference that I know we can make because of sort of blockades along the way. And the other point that I want to sort of reiterate as well is when I was part of the response team when the Kabul Afghan refugees arrived in the United Kingdom. And there were mothers with newborn babies that have waded through sewage in their religious dress to get themselves and their children to safety, to arrive in the UK in the summertime, to be presented with spaghetti strap T-shirts. They would have rather stayed in their religious clothing in a respectful way than wear what we would. And you would think, but don't you want to change? You've been on a plane for 3 days, you've waded through sewage. Absolutely not. Because in disaster, people all around the world cling to what gives them strength, cling to what helps them get through that. And their religion and their culture is such a strong thing, and it actually gets magnified in times of disaster. That's definitely the other thing. And another thing that I want to pick up on what you were saying later in your discussion is what we do as responders is very short term, and the same way that people cling to this, the security of religion, they should also cling to the security of their own communities, their own families, their own friends, because all of us have suffered loss, and you know how important those personal connections are. So as responders, the very nature of our work is short-term intervention and support. We are not there long-term. We should really push people towards their own safety, their own network, and the things that are going to help them recover, or not recover. I mean, that's actually the wrong word, isn't it, Lucy? I never know what word to use, because you don't get over it. You don't recover. You don't move on. You just learn to live in a new way with the pain, and it sort of becomes part of you. But our job is to help that transition in any way that we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, again, if you're listening to this thinking, well, what does that mean for us as an organization or as a board? It's often a question, I think, of drilling down from perhaps some recent near misses or some lessons identified. We as humans are very poor at accepting feedback or criticism. So perhaps one thing I'm always interested in for organizations that have the potential to cause major tragedy is, what are your small incidents telling you? You know, your individual repatriations, a situation where you had to help a crew in crisis, any of those things. If there's some feedback from that, what does it tell you about what you're getting wrong? And that's really a powerful learning that many organizations don't do, and they tend to go, phew, we got through that. But going back to your recent near misses or smaller incidents is often the best way that I find out how an organization is ready to respond.
That sounds like a good learning, if I can put it that way. I wonder, Elmarie, and this is a little bit contrived, but you talk about what is the word, recover, move on. None of them seem appropriate, but it is living come what may. And I use come what may because that, of course, is the title of Lucy's book, which we eagerly await now. But it's a rather different take, this one, Lucy, isn't it? It's more about, I suppose, you've learned a lot of lessons and you're able to put them into play. It's not so much a life story as a almost a manual, is it?
I hope it's a manual. I mean, Elmarie and I love writing a manual or a plan or a framework. And what would happen, you know, the book, When the Dust Settles, had allowed me to go out to these other types of events, you know. And I remember being in the cake shop, where else would I be, at Cheltenham Literary Festival. And people had just been to my talk, and I was kind of hiding. And I could hear them talking about, you know, the management of human remains after transportation disasters. And they were sort of you know, a group of older ladies saying, I just never thought about this. They were having a very gentle, very pleasant conversation. And you said in your intro, you know, one of the difficulties with When the Dust Settles is you raised some quite challenging forensic stories, and seeing what people then did with that and applying it to their own lives. And then what would happen when I was on stage is probably the last 3 or 4 questions I would get from the audience would be about, what happens when you bring these lessons home? How do we use them at home? How do we use them in sudden death? There's a theme in both the books of redundancy. My husband had been made redundant. How do you address these? But also in a wonderfully necessary, you might say quite British way, people had sort of said, go on then, prove it. You know, you say you're all these things, but secretly are you just sat in the bath with a gin bottle, you know, eating chocolates, weeping? And there are obviously those days as well. But there was this, like, you know, what gets Lucy Easthope through this? And the other thing was, as Elmarie has said, when you grow up in this field, you know, from 1718 with the disaster advocacy groups and the disaster campaigners, then going out into the world, you know, somebody had sent me a photo of my first day at Kenyon. You know, I'm 23. When you grow up in this world, what did you get given as gifts from the American psychologists that got you through? How blessed am I to have been immersed in psychological healing, in spiritual healing, in concepts of demobbing, how to shake off the day and bring it home, that I suddenly realized a couple of years ago, we never taught the rest of the world this. We teach it ourselves in our conferences. We never went anywhere with it. So it was this beautiful gift of a chance to write it down. And then the other thing that kind of absolutely catalyzed come what may is that 2 years ago, my dad, very precious man, huge influence in my life and a great helper, died suddenly, with all of these things that come into play, you know, the personal effects, the care of the body, the care of the scene. It wasn't as dramatic as the sort of instance Elmarie and I deal with, but it was close to home. And okay, right, Lucy, everything comes home. You have to get your clan through this. And that did help me revisit a word that I do use for coming back. I think it's right there. Apparently, I haven't been to see it yet, but it's right there in the new Bridget Jones movie. As you know, she says it's not enough to survive; you have to live. And my phrase is borrowed from Native Indigenous Americans, and it's survivance. It's coming alongside the loss with courage, anger, defiance, humor, and you will get your clan through. And that defines both my own personal view of how we all get each other through, how indebted I am to Elmarie for getting me through, and then how we try and pass that on. And that's to sort of link back to your earlier question. it's not about working in corporations or working in business. This is human to human. We will be there, and then we will teach our children how to be there for the next generation, and that's what Come What May was about, really. And so it's hopefully as enjoyable a read, and it'll hopefully, I mean, I remember, and this was such a moment that Elmarie will smile at, because I think I got feedback that one of the airlines, my podcast about the book that had been on high performance, was the most downloaded on a transatlantic flight. And I thought, at what point do they realize what they're listening to? So Come What May too, you perhaps need to have a little bit of a breath in. It is about the world in crisis, but do you know what? It's not telling people things they don't know. People are looking out the window and going, what's happening with the world? The biggest message in Come What May, though, is the value of being ready. Like, how grateful am I to have had a career where we are allowed to say out loud the things that we're worrying about. Everybody else who does that is told that it's kind of a weird anxiety. And Elmarie and I get to do it for a living. What's in our guts, what's in our instinct. So it's a celebration as well of the plan and the planner.
Okay, so Come What May on an airline podcast near you shortly.
Oh, definitely.
We'll look forward to that. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. I want to end with saying that I can't wait to read Come What May, as I loved The Dust Settled. For me, what really is the golden thread in everything that we do in our company and in my career is if it was my mum or my dad. And I think you've just said that. You've got this career experience. But if you can bring it down to, if this was my mom or my dad, what would they need? What would they want to hear the CEO say in the next statement?
Yeah.
What would they want to read the companies doing in the newspaper? Who would they want to book their flights? Who would they want to answer the phone?
Yeah.
Who would my mum want to meet and greet her at the airport? Who would she want to give my children's teddy bear to her if that was found on site?
Yeah.
That is the key. And I think that is probably what Come What May is going to do, is to bring that home. If this was my family and my clan, what would they need? And that, as a CEO of an organization, should give you a very good clue about what your responsibilities are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lucy. I can't wait to see you in person.
See you very soon.
Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. See you.
Wow, well, that's Lucy Easthope, a force of nature, Elmarie. I think it's fair to call her that. She's also a great raconteur, isn't she? And she has so many stories. But I know that you were really keen to focus in on the role and the responsibilities of companies above all, so they really appreciate what they're going to have to deal with when that time comes.
Absolutely. I hope the listeners are as enthused and energized by listening to Lucy as I always am. I think what is really important is for companies to understand that when disaster happens and it involves their brand and their staff and their customers, that there will be an array of agencies involved in different parts of the disaster or the incident or the response as it unfolds. And a good friend, Mark Dombroff, always says that there are these different trains leaving the station at different times, but the organization is on the first train, all the other trains in between, and on the very, very last train. So if you take the responsibility and what we've just talked about, if this was my family, what would they need? You insure correctly. That's the other thing that we forgot to mention in the discussion earlier, is where does the money come from looking after these affected people? If government is not doing it, what is my organization responsible for? And what is it going to cost me? And that is always the concern. But you can insure for this. And the insurance world is so aware of the fact that the better you take care of affected people, the better you take care of your own liability. And I always hate to bring it back to liability, but unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. You want to do the right thing, but it's also going to save you a lot of trouble if you do the right thing.
A very important lesson to learn, I guess. Well, look, I hope you've enjoyed the Go Crisis podcast this time, and make sure you join us for the next one. So from me, goodbye. Elmarie?
Goodbye. See you soon. Thanks, David.